Okay guys, so I'm gonna make a movie, or a video I should say, on karyotypes and chromosomal mutations. This is based on a lecture that we had in class that many of you guys found very interesting because of all the various disorders that was associated with it. So I'm just kind of creating a video in the event that you wanted to kind of look over any of the stuff from class, or say maybe that you missed class and you wanted to kind of keep up. Okay, so in essence what we're looking at is a karyotype. Well, actually two karyotypes. And pretty much what you see here is you have a karyotype for a male and a karyotype for a female. And karyotypes, really, we just call them photographs of an individual's chromosome. So if I were to take a sample from you, maybe sample of your saliva, sample of your blood, uh, sample of, something, some sort of sample of you, I would most likely be able to extract your DNA and could very well do a chromosomal test on you to get a full karyotype of what makes you you. And pretty much what a karyotype is, like I said, it's just all of the individuals, that person's chromosomes in a snapshot. So if you look on the picture, you will notice that there are 23 pairs of chromosomes. And this makes sense because normal human beings have 46 chromosomes. So it would make sense that we would have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Now, most of these chromosomes we say are homologous. Now, what I mean by homologous simply is that they are very similar to each other. So, for example, if I were to take, and I'm going to move my mouse over it, say chromosome number 1, and notice how they're numbered based on what they're classified as. So number 1 represents chromosome number 1. And you will notice that in chromosome number 1, we have one chromosome 1 from mom and one chromosome 1 from dad. They both are classified as chromosome 1 because they carry the same genes. It's just that I got one of them from mom and one of them from dad. Now, say on this chromosome, I had the gene that coded for eye color. So, maybe on dad's chromosome, the gene for eye color is brown, representing brown. But on mom's chromosome, the gene for eye color would be like blue. So technically, even though both of them carry the same gene for eye color, they're slightly different. But they're very, very similar because they're both chromosome 1 and they both carry the same gene. And so that's how we call it homologous, because they're very, very similar to each other, but they're not identical. They're homologous. So as I said, 46 chromosomes or 23 pairs. Now, let's talk a little bit about the karyotype. So, in reality of things, your chromosomes come in what I like to call two flavors. Now, the first flavor of your chromosomes are what we call autosomes, or autosomal chromosomes. And in reality, these are, let me move this out of the way for a second. Okay. In reality, this is the first 22 pairs of your chromosomes. So, think about it this way. All 1 through 22 are classified as autosomes. And the reason they're classified as autosomes is because autosomes literally code for all of the traits that make you you. The traits that make up your hair type, your hair color, your eyes, your eye color, all sorts of things. Every single gene and trait that you could possibly be made of is found all throughout your 22 autosomes. Now, the second flavor of the chromosome world is what we call sex chromosomes. So sex chromosomes, they are only representative of the 23rd pair, or these guys down here. Now, they're really not usually homologous because think about it this way. Males get an X and a Y chromosome. And that's different. So the X chromosome and the Y chromosome, they're two different types of chromosomes. So they're really not that homologous in nature. So we say they're usually not really homologous. Now, the sex chromosomes, why they're so important is because they determine your sex. Out of all of the things that could have possibly made you you, your sex chromosomes are really what hold all of the material to help you either be male or female. So if you're a female, you're going to have what we call a double X or an XX. That's always standard for normal, chromosomally normal females will always have an XX. And usually the males will always be XY. Normal males are always chromosomally XY. So that's usually what we call our sex chromosomes. Now, if you're following along in your notes, I just want you to kind of box and label all of the autosomes in your pictures that you have in your notes. And you can pause the video if you want to kind of do that at this time. So after you've come back and you've done it, this is usually what you should have found. You should have found the box around the first 22 of your chromosomal pairs because those are all your autosomes. And we do the same for the female. And now what I want you to do is I want you to circle and label the sex chromosomes. So if you notice, everything that's left is classified as a sex. We got that XY and that XX. So really that's kind of chromosomes in a nutshell. So, just to think things through, say parents are wanting to have a child, and in order for them to have a girl, our mom is going to pass her X chromosome. Because remember, mom only has two X's. She only has an X to pass. She couldn't pass anything else except for an X. And dad, on the other hand, now dad's got a 50-50 chance. He can either pass an X chromosome or he can pass a Y chromosome. Well, since we're making girl, I need to have her sex chromosome pairs be XX. So that means dad must pass her the X. See how we have that double X in the picture? This is what is determining us having a little girl. Now, on the other hand, if it was a boy, mom, of course, like I said, she only has an X to pass, so that's what she's passing. But at the same time, dad has a 50-50 chance, and he has a Y chromosome. So when daddy passes a Y chromosome on, okay, that's how we get boys. So notice that's really how it comes all together. Mom always passes the X, and dad is what's determining the sex. He'll either pass an X or he'll pass a Y. And depending on which one he passes, really determines the sex of the baby. Alright, so let's talk just about changes in our chromosomes. So we've talked about mutations before when we were talking a little bit about cell division and mitosis, and we talked about point mutations in the DNA and various things like that. We've kind of discussed mutations, and in essence, a mutation just kind of boils down to a random change. So it's a random change in a sequence of nucleotides in DNA. So it's something that happened, and we weren't really expecting it to happen, but it just happened randomly. Or what can happen with the mutation is it could completely change the structure of the chromosome. So remember, chromosomes hold genes. Okay, chromosomes really are just supercoiled genes. So what we could do is, if it really is a heck of a mutation, we could actually completely change the structure of our chromosome. And so that's kind of how our mutations will boil down. You'll either have what we call gene mutations or genetic mutations, and then we'll have what we call chromosomal mutations. Now, just for fun, I asked you, which one of these is worse? Having a gene mutation or having a chromosomal mutation? And some of you guys got it right off the bat, and some of you were still split on your decision. But usually the way that it works in mutations is chromosomal mutations are usually worse than gene mutations. And the reason being is if I have a gene, the gene is just a small portion of the chromosome. It's just a little part of the chromosome, right? Because chromosomes hold genes. So if I'm only messing with one little part of it, that's really not as bad as messing with the entire thing. So if I'm messing with the whole chromosome, that's going to have more detrimental effects and more problems than if I were just messing with a little part of it. Alright, so I know we haven't talked about meiosis, and trust me, we will in future, don't worry. But just for now, I know some of you might be curious, well, how do these chromosomal mutations even happen in the first place? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Well, what happens usually with the chromosome is by a by a source of what we call non-disjunction. So non-disjunction can be a real problem depending on where it actually falls in meiosis. So if you remember back to mitosis. Now, please don't be confused with the terminology I'm using. Mitosis with a T is very, very different than meiosis. I know they sound almost identical, but there is actually a very big difference between them. And so the reason really what's differentiating them is mitosis is just used to replace all of the cells in your somatic cells in your body. So all of the regular cells that make up your skin, that makes up your organs, things like that. All of those cells need to eventually be replaced and replenished, and so your body goes through mitosis to give it a new cell to replace whatever was dead or messed up or whatever. And so they're always two identical cells. Now, in meiosis, which we'll learn about later, you're actually creating two sex cells, the two sex cells that we have. Now, depending on what your sex is, you'll either be creating an X, I'm sorry, not an X, my pen. You're either creating an egg or you're creating a sperm. And so meiosis is the process in which we get our eggs and our sperm. Okay, so that's kind of why that's important. It's really the process that we use to make our sex cells, or our gametes, sometimes as they're called. Now, looking at this, okay, thinking back to mitosis, because that's what we're most familiar with, in anaphase, we said that cells, or the chromosomes, okay, they're starting to pull away from each other, right? A is for away. So they're pulling away from each other at the poles. And usually when we depicted it, because it's the way it's supposed to be, there is always an even exchange. So there's always a half of the chromosomes go to one pole and half of the chromosomes go to another pole. But did you ever wonder, what if one of them didn't go where it was supposed to go? Maybe it was supposed to go to the right, but it accidentally went to the left. So what happens then? Well, we say what happened is a non-disjunction. And if you kind of look at this picture down here, this is really kind of what happened. So looking at this cell, when it's about to divide, it's supposed to have half of its chromosomes in this cell and half of its chromosomes in this cell. But what happened in reality is all of its chromosomes moved into that one cell and left the other one blank. That's what we would refer to as a non-disjunction. And later, when that cell divides, it causes more genetic material than really what it's supposed to have. And then this one over there has none. And it can also happen in a different way. It can happen at different points in time of meiosis. If you look here, this guy, when he was supposed to divide and have one in each, what happened is both of them went to just one. So this is what we're talking about non-disjunction. It just fails to separate. Alright, so usually what happens with this then is there's a mutation usually in the entire chromosome. And like I said before, it can cause a lot of problems. This is usually what leads to chromosomal mutations. Now, in a nutshell, non-disjunction is really when chromosome pairs do not separate properly at anaphase, like I said. In mitosis, if non-disjunction happened in mitosis, usually those cells would just kind of die and be absorbed and just done. But if it happened in meiosis, that can be a serious problem. Because remember, meiosis is what is actually creating our eggs and our sperm. So if our eggs have not the right genetic material in it, when it gets fertilized, that means the baby won't have the right genetic material. And that can cause some serious problems during development. Same thing goes with the sperm. So here is kind of the picture again that I showed you with meiosis 1 versus meiosis 2. And yes, there are two phases of mitosis, or meiosis, I should say. So that's something that we will look forward to later, but I just kind of wanted to re-show you that non-disjunction and what I mean by that. Alright, so let's kind of get into what non-disjunction can create. It can create, number one, something called a monosomy. Now this is what happens when, say, the pair of chromosomes, let's say a pair for chromosome 1, You're supposed to have 2 copies, right? Pair. What if one of those copies was missing? Well, we call it a monosomy if one of the pairs is missing. And so, because it's down to one, mono means one. Now, people who have a monosomy, they're, instead of having 46 chromosomes, they are said to have 45 chromosomes, always one less, okay? And again, this usually occurs because of non-disjunction. Now, on the flip side, if I got a little bit less than what I was supposed to have in one cell, that means I'm going to have a little bit more than what I should have in another cell. And so that's where this thing called trisomy comes into play. And trisomy is what we say 3 chromosomes are present in a one particular pair. So what do I mean by that? Well, what if chromosome 1, instead of having 2 copies, okay, a pair like it's supposed to have, what if it had 3 copies? So that again is what we'll call a trisomy. And instead of that individual having 46 chromosomes, it is said that that individual has 47 chromosomes, okay? And go ahead, it occurs because of this non-disjunction. Now, the last one, and the one I find very, very interesting, is what we call polyploidy. Now, polyploidy is usually what happens when non-disjunction occurs in all of the chromosome pairs. So instead of just chromosome 1 having a problem, what if chromosomes 1 through 23 all got duplicated? So instead of having 46 chromosomes, I would have 69 chromosomes or something absurd like that, or 92 chromosomes, which is if you're a human or an animal, you can't live like that. You're in genetic overload. Your whole body just aborts it and you die. But this is actually can be done. This polyploidy can actually be done in some plants. And believe it or not, we have a lot of polyploidy fruits that we actually buy in the grocery store. And we're going to talk a little bit about the strawberries later. So I'm going to hold off on that point. But let's just kind of think about these different ploidies as we move into, I'm sorry, not ploidies, ploidies and trisomy and monosomy. Let's look at them as we move forward into some of these disorders. So the first one I want to talk about is what we call Turner syndrome. Now, ladies, hate to break this to you, but it's only, this syndrome only affects girls. So usually what has happened in this one, if you look at the karyotype down here, you'll notice that one of her X's is missing. So she's supposed to have 2 X's, but instead she only has 1. So in reality, she's a monosomy because she has only 45 chromosomes instead of 46. Now, this can cause a whole gambit of problems. It can cause the person to have serious heart problems. It can cause people with Turner syndrome are usually really, really slow to grow. So they're very, very short, clinically midgets, most of them. They have what we call a webbed neck or an excess skin around the neck. As you can kind of see in her neck, it looks very, very thick, like there's extra skin there. That's a webbed neck feature. They usually have slight kind of droopy eyes. And the big thing is usually women that are in Turner syndrome, they're usually sterile, meaning they're not able to have kids because they have incomplete puberty. So they're usually most of their reproductive system does not fully develop, and as a result, they do not menstruate, most of them. And so that non-menstruation is what causes that infertility to occur. So usually these women also have very little breast tissue. They usually don't really develop breasts unless they're doing hormone therapy. And so it's really amazing what one little chromosome can do. So here's another picture. I know some of this is really graphic, I understand. But just to let you know, about 96 to 98% of the people born with Turner syndrome do not actually survive to birth. So obviously, all of these pictures that you see down here that are pretty gruesome, yeah, these are babies that had Turner syndrome that actually died in vitro. So they died while they were a fetus inside their womb. And they more or less was like a stillbirth or, a thing like that. And so this 2% turns out to be very similar to this picture, which has all of the features that I told you then. no menstruation, no breast development, no hips, broad shoulders and neck, things like that. Okay, so the next one that I find really interesting is not a monosomy, but in fact a trisomy. And more particular, it's trisomy 21. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at this karyotype down here. Trisomy 21 shows that on chromosome number 21, we have three copies of our um, chromosome 21. And so it's those three copies that cause a gambit of problems. And these particular problem we classify as Down syndrome. So some things that you should know about Down syndrome, it's actually one of the most common chromosomal disorders out there. It affects both men and women. It's very defining. If you see somebody who has Down syndrome, it's usually very evident that they have Down syndrome, and that's because of their various features around their face. They usually have a very flattened nose and face usually. They have these kind of upward slanting eyes that have really heavy creases over the top of them. They're heavy eyelids. And usually the shape of their head is very particular. It's usually a little bit larger than the rest of them, and so it's very defining. Also, some other minor things that they don't actually have normal palm creases, like kind of you see in that baby hand. They have what we call a simian crease, which is just one usually line across the center of their hand. They also have more skin creases on their feet, and their big toe is wider set from the rest of the other toes. So those are some minor things like that. The big thing, though, is that people with Down syndrome have heavy mental retardation, and most of them are unable to live on their own. They're going to need somebody to actually look after and care for them. So very heavy mental retardation. However, they're very sweet and compassionate people, and thanks to modern medicine, a lot of them are living way past their 30s, which was originally kind of the death rate for them. They usually would die in the 30s, but thanks to modern medicine, a lot of them are living until their 60s. So it really is, they can have a nice full life, but at the same time, you just have to be careful because usually they're more susceptible to certain disorders and diseases and various things like that. Okay. The next one, which is also a trisomy, and this one, guys, is strictly for you. Sorry, ladies, you can't have this one. It's called Klinefelter syndrome. And so Klinefelter syndrome actually affects not your autosomes, but your sex chromosomes. So usually guys who have Klinefelter syndrome, their their count is usually 47XXY. So they have an extra X chromosome, which is usually really, really interesting in what it does. So usually these guys who have Turner syndrome, they're very tall, most of them, taller than most other males, um, and they have a beautiful full head of hair. Typically, usually they're not usually subject to male pattern balding. Most of them have very good full heads of hair. The bad thing is that they have very, very small testicles, and to go with that, very low testosterone levels. And so, as a result, their muscle tone, they have a less of a muscle tone, so they don't really get a very muscular body. It's more feminine in a sense, where it's not as muscular but more lean. They really have a very hard time growing facial hair and just body hair in general. And one of the main things that leads for Klinefelter is that they're usually infertile, meaning it's not completely impossible for them to have children, but it's next to none having it. They're very infertile, so they're usually not able to have kids of their own. Another thing is they have what we call a unicoidal body, meaning their bodies are usually in the curvature of what you would find a woman. So women, they're very hippie, they're very curvy. Everybody wants that hourglass or that Coke bottle figure. Well, that's great on a girl, but unfortunately, people who have Klinefelter syndrome, these guys, they can also be subject to that same curvature and have really curvy features. And some of them, not all of them, but some of them even take it a step further and fall under what we call gynecomastia. Now, gynecomastia is actually the breast tissue development in male, which of course no males really want to develop breasts. It can draw some really awkward attention to them. So it's those different features that really kind of define Klinefelter syndrome. All right. Now, the next one is very similar, okay, to Klinefelter when we kind of look at its chromosomes, but please don't be mistaken. Remember, Klinefelter is trisomy XXY, but Jacob's syndrome is trisomy XYY. So instead of having an extra X as we saw in Klinefelter, we're having an extra Y. And this happens in about 1 in 1800 birds. And I know all of you men out there, you're like, oh, that's fantastic. I get an extra Y chromosome. I'm more, manly and great, kind of thing like that. Well, not exactly. That extra Y chromosome actually causes these men a lot of problems. They're usually taller in stature of most males, which is really not the problem, but they are subject to very harsh acne, even in their adult life, going all the way up. They have a lot of acne problems. They also have a lot of learning problems in school. So they have a lot of learning disabilities. It's harder for them to kind of catch on. And they have what I call delayed emotional maturity. So meaning they don't really, they're socially inept. A lot of them, they're really not sure how to kind of voice their emotions and their feelings, and as a result, a lot of them are extremely aggressive in nature. They can be very, very aggressive, and to the point where a lot of people are concerned, and they draw a lot of attention to themselves. And it's really not because they want to, it's just they have this disorder, and it is what it is. It kind of creates that emotional turmoil inside. So we call that Jacob syndrome. Okay. Triple X syndrome. Well, triple X, I don't actually have a picture for that, and the reason being is because women, which are only women who can have this, that have triple X, they actually have no unusual physical features. So if you saw a person with triple X, you really wouldn't know they had triple X unless they told you, because they look completely normal. It happens in about 1 in 1,000 birds, and they have normal features. Some of them are usually taller than average. They have normal sexual development, so they go through puberty, all those things like that, and they can conceive children. The big thing about this, though, is they have a risk for a learning disability. Also, they have usually a delay in the development of their speech, so they really can't talk very clearly. Their language skills are poor. Also, their motor skills. So motor skills is what helps you function and move, and those can also be a little bit delayed in development. They also have a weaker muscle tone, so they really don't have a lot of muscle in their body. Well, they have some, but not built up. They also have a lot of behavioral and emotional problems. Many of them are extremely emotional, and it's really hard to kind of, if you were a person that had triple X, it's really hard to kind of not know what these emotions are being stirred from. You just know you have them. And then about 10% of them usually suffer from anywhere from seizures to kidney abnormalities. So this can be very severe, and I imagine some of them would have to be on dialysis for such things. Okay. Edwards trisomy syndrome. Now this one is going to be a little graphic. From the standpoint is this one is a little bit more rare out of the autosomal trisomies. It happens in about 1 in 4,400 birds. Okay, it can happen with males and females, about 80% females, 20% males. And we say that this is a trisomy of number 18 chromosome. So if you look at number 18 over here in its circle, you'll see that we have 3 copies of the number 18 chromosome. And usually what this will lead to is stillbirth. Usually they don't fully come to term, many of them. But some of the symptoms that include like a small head or microcephaly, they're usually mentally retarded by a lot. It causes them a lot of learning disabilities and whatnot. Their internal organs, they usually have abnormalities with them. And about 90% of them die before the first 5 months of age. So it's a very serious disorder from that standpoint because it really can affect, a gambit of things for not only the mom, but I mean, think about it this way: if the baby is only going to last about 5 months, you can just imagine the number of problems it must have if it would die so soon. All right, the last one I believe that we're going to be talking about is trisomy syndrome. So this is the rarest that we can find, at least out of our scope of genetic disorders right now. And this is what happens in about 1 in 14,000 births. So it can be for male or for female, and it is a trisomy again. It's actually trisomy 13. So chromosome 13 has an extra chromosome due to, again, non-disjunction. And on this page, you can kind of see some of the babies that develop from this trisomy syndrome. Usually the symptoms are a very small head, usually small or missing eyes, some of them. Um, they have a lot of heart defects to the point where it can really just be fatal. They can sometimes have extra fingers, as you kind of see in those pictures over there. They have what we call abnormal genitalia. Your genitalia is like your penis or your vagina, things like that. Those are genitalia. So theirs is abnormally shaped or developed. They have very serious mental retardation and something we call the cleft palate. So the cleft palate is where the roof of your mouth doesn't close fully, and so if you kind of look at this guy here, you can see there's like a hole between his nasal passage and his mouth. So these things, they don't fully develop properly, and that's what we call that cleft palate. Um, People can have a cleft palate without actually having tattoo syndrome, but it is very common for those who do have this syndrome to have that. And the reason it's so severe is because most of them die within the first few weeks after birth. Even if they came to, full term, usually they only last a few weeks afterwards. Okay, so this is kind of the last slide I was going to tell you guys about, and I told you I'd recap back on polyploidy. Now, polyploidy is what we say have multiple sets of chromosomes, right? So if we look at this karyotype over here, we see that every single one of our chromosome numbers has an extra. There's 3 for every single one of them. Now, if we were in a human, we couldn't do that. You could see what happened when you just have one extra chromosome, 47 instead of 46. Can you just imagine what the human being would look like if they had all of their chromosomes extra? It would be pretty disastrous. But on the other hand, plants actually they could do polyploidy quite well. So the picture that you see above, where the woman has strawberries in her hand, that's actually the normal size of most strawberries that are not polyploidy. But usually those ones we don't find in the grocery store. Instead, we find these beautiful, succulent, big strawberries. And these big strawberries that we're usually buying at the grocery store, they're genetically modified. They're genetically modified to stunt their cell cycle at a certain phase so that they have lots and lots and lots of genetic material, and they're a polyploidy. Because if I have a lot of genetic material, then that means my cell is going to have to be bigger to hold it. And if my cell is bigger, then I'm going to be bigger altogether. So that's kind of the understanding behind the polyploidy. So I want you to be thinking about this just to kind of think about it for now. I'll explain it in just a minute. You can probably pause your video if you don't want me to give you the explanation. But my question is, describe what's the difference between a gene mutation and a chromosome mutation. Now, if you remember back from what I was saying earlier, a gene mutation just affects a very specific gene. So maybe the gene that codes for your eye color, or the gene that codes for your hair color, or something like that. If I had a mutation on that, I'm going to have a very specific outcome based on just that one gene being affected. It's not like everything else is going to be affected, just the thing that that gene codes for. On the other hand, a chromosome carries many, many genes. So many genes are being affected at once. And so that chromosomal mutation is what is really can do a lot of damage in comparison to the gene mutation, because there's more things that are messed up than just in a gene mutation. So that's all I'm going to cover for this particular video. But we will continue